had a different story for me. My mother did not only facilitate my admission in several and many ways, but also that of my elder brother, Essien Umoh, and that was also made possible by one of my mother's brothers, our uncle, Chief Egbe Egbara, Chief Monday Egbe Egbara, who incidentally was a historian too, and currently teaches history in the College of Education, Ogoja campus. My brother also read history in the University of Calabar, while I studied history in the University of Uyo. And incidentally, I proceeded into military history as a sub-specialization at the postgraduate level, and he also proceeded into military history at the sub-specialization in the postgraduate level. Most profoundly is that while I majored in the Niger Delta, first in the Civil War and then the Niger Delta, he is majoring in the Civil War of Nigeria. It's important to state this because that foundation was all I needed to stand here before you today. And without a sacrifice by my mom and that very late supplementary admission by Professor Fola Lasisi, I don't think I would have taken this route today. But against all odds and in everything, I had the fortunacy of being a student of the Department of History, not just the Department of History, but in that admission year, history added a suffix to it, international studies. So I became one of the pioneer students of the Department of History and International Studies in the University of Uyo. A change, an addition that was highly very facilitated by Professor Otto Abasi Akpan. And we had very bright minds that made me to change my mind as it has to do with progression into being a lawyer. Professor Monday Benson Abasetai, Fellow Historical Society of Nigeria, Professor Okone Deduya, who came later as an adjunct lecturer in that department, and most importantly, Professor Monde Noir, Professor Sylvester Michael Eka, Dr. Clayton Odor, Professor Dominus Essien, and to mention those few ones that had a very strong impact on me, were in that department and trained me sufficiently to become the historian I was. Professor Dominus Essien was my supervisor at the BL level, on the undergraduate level, and supervised me on the title, on the topic, A History of the University of Uyo, 1991 to 2003. I never knew that that title will haunt me back to the university to join hands in building a university that I once wrote a story about, but it was now to be time, much later, to build upon that story and extend the frontiers of this great citadel of learning. But that wouldn't have been without much facilitation and help as an undergraduate student by a colleague I've grown to really respect in a relationship of over 27 years, Dr. Mfon Akwang, who then was a class captain throughout our years as undergraduate students, and who, by the vicissitudes of fate, replaced me as head of department when His Excellency, Pastor Dr. Umoh Baseno, by his benevolence and God's providence, appointed me as the Honorable Commissioner for Education in February 2025. It's on that note I would proceed to consider that some lecturers had a significant influence on me outside my department because I was not interested just to be a student in one department. I was a student in many departments. I will speak first to Professor Enyekan Brown, a criminologist who was in the Department of Sociology, of which I attended several lectures that were not borrowed or adjunct courses. I would also speak to Professor Enobasi Ura, who is in the Department of Linguistics and Nigerian Languages. I would also speak to Professor Ini Uko, who is in the Department of English. And I also speak to Professor Umoh, who is in the Department of Computing, or Department of Computer Science as it was then. And these lecturers gave me a more expanded view about knowledge because of how they were visible in the context of calibrating knowledge and facilitating my desire not just to be like them, but to be better than them. I don't know if I'm able to achieve that. I would greatly commend the brief stint I had with Professor Ini Udoka, who left the department for politics, first on appointment and then on election. It was so sad that we never had the opportunity to meet with this very brilliant scholar again, who was the fortress of economic history in the Department of History and International Studies. Professor Ini Udoka, the things you did in my first and second year, and when you came back briefly before you left almost eternally, has been the point in which I have grown over the years. It is interesting to know that Professor Ini Udoka was also appointed a Commissioner for Education, the same position and office I have come to inherit. And that is when the past greets the present, and the present has a handshake with the past. Thank you very much, Professor Honorable Ini Udoka. I will still proceed with that to consider that in 2003, I was ready to leave the University of Uyo for the Mandatory Youth Service Corps. And between 2003 and 2004, when I left, we had this very, very courageous Vice Chancellor in the person of Professor Akpan Hogan Ekpo. Professor Akpan Hogan Ekpo served as the Vice Chancellor that brought a whole lot of upheavals and what the historian would call a revolution in the administration and also the intellectual growth of that university, giving the university a name and a brand that we have all come to become very proud of. When I left for youth service, I did not chart a career and a pathway in being a lecturer. But Professor Ini Udoka and later Professor Otto Basekman, who became the head of department, impressed upon me that it was important that I come back to the Department of History and invest all that had been planted in me. I did not take that serious until it became a divine instruction by the duo of Pastor Cyril Bassi, the pastor that currently I'm under in Royal Household Ministries, and Pastor Gabriel Thomas, and also Pastor Ubong. It is needful to state this because my life has been on a providential trajectory. And at the time, Professor Otto Basekman pressed on me very hard to return. I had a job with the university, with V-Mobile Nigeria. Then it was Econet Wireless, and then transformed to the V-Mobile Nigeria. He encouraged me to come back, and I can remember one of those occasions when he pressed so hard. I had come back from youth service, I was working there. When he pressed so hard, I told him, then he was a doctor, Dr. Akpan, how much is your salary? He was a senior lecturer then. And he said 64,000 naira. I said, send your account number to me. He sent his UB account number, and I sent 70,000 naira to him, which was not even half of my salary. And I tell him, I appeal to you not to bring this back again. At that time, he was using an Airtel line 00233323364. While I was on a special staff line of 08022227164, I looked at his line. The airtime appeared very miserable for a lecturer. And I saw on the line that he just loaded 500 naira airtime with a 7 days validity period. And I added 20,000 on that airtime. And I called him. I said, henceforth, don't trouble me again. I have found a resting place and a place that I should move henceforth. I could remember his voice on the phone that day. He said, you are a very stupid boy. He said, where you are will destroy you, and where you should be is a university. Professor Otto Basekban received the gift from me, but still instructed me, not advising me, to come back to the University of Uyo Department of History. I told him that there were many other people. Then, heads of department had a very strong input in bringing any staff, an academic staff, into the department. And he stood on his grounds and said that you will come back to this department. I said, why don't you give it to someone that has a job, that doesn't have a job? I have a job already. And in all of that consideration, many things happened that made that possible for me to follow the pathway as led by him. I would recall vividly how Professor Otto Basekban fell in love with me. I would recall on the grounds that Professor Otto Basekban has read my script once and sent the class rep in Kwang to call me. And when I went at his office, he said, did you write this in the exams hall? I said, yes. He brought out another clean sheet of paper and said, write it again in front of me. I wrote the exams again in front of him, making several citations and punctuations for the historical methodology. And when I was done, in 2 hours before him, he asked for each of those citations, the names, the authors, the page number, the year of publication, and everything. And he asked for the books. He followed me to the library, Young Essien Library. I picked up some of the books. I went back to my house and I picked some of the books I inherited from my dad, who had studied in the University of Nigeria and Nsukka. And when he brought it and saw that the page numbers, the authors, the year of publication were correct, he said, you are the light we need in this department. That was the encounter I had with him as a second-year student in the Department of History and International Studies, University of Uyo. So it was that strong that he had to bring me back. But again, in all that I tried, Providence and men's advice brought me back to the Department of History and International Studies, where in 2008 January I assumed duties as a graduate assistant with a salary of 46,000 naira. I was in a relationship in 2004, between 2004 when I left for youth service and 2007 when I made that decision to leave V-Mobile Nigeria. And that relationship crashed because of that decision. The lady could not understand why I could make such a decision and said that it was not ordinary, but I had to be controlled spiritually from a remote base, probably in my village. But I could remember the words of Pastor Cyril Bassi and Gabriel Thomas that if I try to do any other thing apart from that which God has asked me to do at the time he has asked me to do, that he, the Lord, would frustrate me. It was better that the devil frustrates you than God himself frustrating you. And at that time, I had to get back to put my act in order and leave. It was by the dint of all providence that the lady that left me came back after I received my second salary of 46,000 naira. I wish I would have been able to display the pay slip for graduate assistants that have come in now to see how it was. And she came back with all seriousness and said, if this is what God and humanity, divinity and humanity wants you to do, I'm going to follow you to the end. And I considered that I'd found a wife in her. That person became my wife in 2009, June. Her name is Grace, and bequeathed for me 3 children by name Grace, Ubong, and Fon. Please, can my wife stand up, please? I thank her for coming back. We have a 17-year relationship together in marriage, and far more than that, as it has to do with courtship and marriage. When I remember her, I remember another lady, Mrs. Alice Ivy Essien, who was the executive secretary of the scholarship board in 2004, 2005, when I had the opportunity to work with her as her personal assistant. Alice Essien, if you're here, please, can you stand up? Mrs. Alice Essien was actually the secretary of the scholarship board in a board that made me to meet, while working there, meet my wife, Grace, who came to get a scholarship form. The rest, they say, is history. I came back to the University of Uyo to start a career that became fulfilled by, first of all, serving under Ambassador Professor Okun Edetwia. Ambassador Professor Okun Edetwia was an accomplished historian, what we would call a revered titular deity of history, with frontline experience in historical methodology. Uya put me through the drills and trails of history. I served as his graduate assistant and also his assistant lecturer up till the point when I left to the Nigerian Defense Academy for my PhD. Meeting Uya made me to meet a young and tenacious, vibrant historian, Professor David Imboa, the 151st Inaugural Lecturer of the University of Calabar, which I had the graciousness to read his citation. Professor Imboa, then an assistant lecturer, was Professor Uya's assistant lecturer over at the University of Calabar while I was here in the University of Uyo. Professor Uya supervised my MA dissertation on war and scientific stimulation, a study of Biafran technological development in the Nigerian Civil War. And he and Professor Otoba Sekban encouraged me to go to the Nigerian Defense Academy and deepen my specialization after a brief stint in the University of Ibadan for the first postgraduate studies. I would really thank now Professor Akanaren Essien, who in a special session accelerated and facilitated my exit on staff development to the Nigerian Defense Academy in Kaduna. If I did not leave at that time, I think so many things would have gone wrong, and I thank him so much. He's a vice chancellor that made it possible for staff of this university to earn full salaries while on staff development. And I went to Kaduna on full staff development, earning my full salary. Thank you again, Professor Akana Renessien. And at the Defense Academy, it got brighter. I would meet a cocktail of men, resources, and platform that made my training as a military historian effective and complete. For these men, I will remember with nostalgia the 25th Commandant of the Defense Academy, Major General CEO Nwaniba, who has sent his goodwill. And he availed me the latitude to be part of the various book projects in the Defense Academy. Again, I will remember Major General M.I. Idris, who served as the 26th Commandant of the Nigerian Defense Academy, that allowed me to be part of the building of several centers in the Nigerian Defense Academy, Kaduna. I would also commend, that one is not with nostalgia because it's here with me, Brigadier General Koko Essien, who was the Academy Registrar when I was an undergraduate student and who now serves as the Commissioner for Internal Security of Akwa Ibom State. Thank you very much. General Essien, and I'm very grateful for what you did to me, for me, not because I was from Akwa Ibom State, but it was rare to see people from Akwa Ibom State holding such commands at that time. He was very kind to me, not because I was from Akwa Ibom. I was the only Akwa Ibom person in that academy at that time. But he saw light in me and decided to ensure that that light got brighter over the years. I remember Major General I.M.E. Umoh, who functioned as the military assistant to the 25th Commandant of India, and Rear Admiral N.F. Damtong, who during his stint as a postgraduate student availed me so much of platform for a whole lot of capacity. Then I would consider my head of department at the time at the Defense Academy, who has achieved a rare feat by being both a professor and a military and a major general in the Nigerian Army. I'm talking about Major General Professor Shaibu Ibrahim. I would really thank him for the exposure he gave me. And then for the civilian counterpart, the revered Professor Chinedu Nwafo Oba, Emeritus Professor in that making, and considering also Professor Ojong Echum Tamban, my supervisor and the Dean of the Postgraduate School, upon my admission, and also most especially with so much of nostalgia, Professor Chukuma Confidence Chukukadibia Osakwe. We call him CCC Osakwe, and it will get us back to this thing we call CCC, cause, and consequence. I will get back to that. Professor Chukuma Confidence Chukukadibia Osakwe did so much for me. He was my benefactor and even adopted me as a father there. I had a house, I had a room in his house, in his village, Ogi, the same village that Professor Chino Achebe is from. And they combined to direct my inquisitiveness in writing on the topic, or the title, or the topic, the Joint Task Force and Insurgency in the Niger Delta of Nigeria in the periodization 1999 to 2009. That was the thesis that took me to the intestine of creeks in the Niger Delta, where I met with an array of all sorts of people from all walks of life. I have met with several militant commanders. I've met with several people. I wish I would never meet them again because of some experiences that the opportunity of time would not allow me to present and reel out. But I would really thank again Professor Usman Tar. He was in the Department of Defense and Security Studies in the Defense Academy. But like what I did in the University of Uyo, I went across departments and faculties at the Defense Academy. And again, my external examiner, Professor Ibrahim Jumare of Usman Dan Fodio University, Sokoto, who has really been helpful in advancing this career of mine. And I would also consider that it was my stint on that topic that took me to these creeks that made me to reconnect with my elder brother, Sergeant Benton Umoh, in the creeks of Egbemangalabri, the creeks, the Clough Creek, and others that exposed me to actually the Nigeria's problem taking place in the Niger Delta. These mentors did a whole lot for me and gave me a whole lot of resources, but in the end, most especially, gave me a repository of platforms that helped to manage my inquisitiveness and originality. And in the military wing of the India, the Academy Library, the postgraduate school, availed me a whole lot of resourcefulness. The centers, and many other departments in that academy helped me a whole lot. But most importantly, the academy serviced many military institutions that they indulged my expertise. Few of them would be the Command and Staff College in Jaji, the Nigerian Army School of Infantry in Jaji, the School of Artillery in Kachia, the Defense College, the Defense College was formerly known as the War College in Abuja, the Nigerian Army Resource Center, the Army War College, the Air Force War College, the Naval War College. I wouldn't have been able to have access to the platforms of these institutions, but not for the benevolence of this institution and the men in that institution. But in all, it was very important that at the end I defended my PhD with distinctions and had a grade that was completely overwhelming for the Defense Academy in terms of what had happened previously. Academy immediately and instantaneously offered to retain my services at the Defense Academy and provided me with a whole lot of generous startups that would make anyone not consider turning back on those things. But importantly, some of my lecturers, like Professor Inyudoka, Professor Chris Ekong, were at the forefront of insisting that I should come back based on local patriotism and also based on the fact that I had benefited from a staff development that required that I should come back. But NDA was ready to pay off everything and anything that was spent on me to have me back. I found it particularly interesting in as much as I felt like coming back, but I considered that was the best place for me to grow. But again, Professor Tobasekpan coming back insisted that it was the intent of the Department of History that I go on the staff development and return to build a postgraduate arm of the department in this field of military and strategic studies after the model of the Nigerian Defense Academy. In 2008, before I left for my PhD, the department was split into 10 subspecializations, which military and strategic studies was one of them. And in as much as I really thought I should leave, I came back to the Department of History and International Studies, and my return meant a whole lot of things for me. And upon that return, I would really thank Professor Comfort Ekpo, the role she played in ensuring that I returned to the University of Uyo. But beyond that, I got back to build the department, and the God that sees in secret and rewards in the open made it such that the Faculty of Arts considered, under the deanship of Professor Inyang, that I was given an accelerated promotion, and that was upheld at the Central ANPC by Professor Comfort Ekpo, and that made it possible for me to return to the University of Uyo and proceed in this journey. I would again thank his the senior advocate of Nigeria, who was one of our illustrious vice chancellors, distinguished Professor Essien, who made sure that I did not only return, but I stayed in the University of Uyo. And in all, he was the one that graciously announced me as the Associate Professor of Military History, and also appointed me as the Deputy Director of the School of Continuing Education and Professional Studies in the University of Uyo. Professor Nyaodon Dayo will inherit me with all my troubles, and upon his discretion, appointed me as the head of department to a department that was far older than me in age. I thank you, Professor Nyaodon Dayo, because I was mostly called small boy HOD, made possible by appointment here in Senate. By that appointment, I became a member of Senate, and it was also his goodwill that he was the one that announced me as full professor of military history here in the University of Uyo. Interrupting my progression in the University of Uyo was a man I would call a golden personality to Akwa Ibom State. And that is His Excellency, Pastor Dr. Umoh, who by providence and his benevolence identified and appointed me as as Honorable Commissioner for Education in Akwa Ibom State. I really don't know how to thank him all times and every day for this opportunity that provided me a platform to meet with the best of minds in a citadel of decision knowledge, production, and decision-making called the Executive Council of Akwa Ibom State EXCO. I have made the best of minds in that place, starting with the Deputy Governor, distinguished Senator Dr. Akone Yaye, the Secretary to the State Government, Prince Ubong, the Head of Service then, Mr. Essien, and the next Head of Service that came in, Elsie Peters, Mrs. Elsie Peters, and my distinguished colleagues, Professor Nwaniba, and the Attorney General, and all colleagues in EXCO. I have found my relationship with them very, very eventful. I thank them so much for the opportunity given, and it's at this time that I consider that I would ape upon the flow of this unending gratitude. While in the University of Uyo, I started projecting my career to the direction that would make me a professor someday. But I thank again the various commanders of various military formations in the contiguous environment of Akwa Ibom State, NNS Jubilee, NNS Victory, NNS Pathfinder, the Eastern Naval Command, the Western Naval Command, the Central Naval Command, for all that they have done by availing me several platforms for me to be able to be that which I am. Upon my exit, I had only produced 2 doctoral students, one Dr. Blessing Edet. Upon my exit as leave of absence, Dr. Blessing Edet, who I would consider my protege, and Dr. Major Uti from the Nigerian Defense Academy. The lone military historian we had, Professor Ibiangewa, we lost him last year, leaving no military historian in the Department of History and International Studies until this year, when Dr. Blessing Edet had joined the staff architecture of the Department of History and International Studies as a military historian. Now, I move to the core of this presentation, which wouldn't take long as much as this gratitude have ebbed out, flown. That gratitude is necessary because I had always looked for this opportunity to thank every person that have made me the kind of person that I am today. Please, the next slide. The discipline of history and the sub-discipline of military history. The whole gamut of the discipline of history is about change, and my argument in the context of also the contribution to knowledge has been that change goes alongside with continuity. I will connect this again with my sojourn and travel, also in the context of having things to do with mathematics. That change goes with continuity, and history is about change and continuity. But not just change and continuity, but the cause of the change, the cause of that change, and the consequence of the change. Then the cause of the continuity, and the consequence of that continuity. So history is a cause, and consequence of change and continuity. That has been what I have drummed in the ears of my undergraduate and postgraduate students as it has to do with history. And I'll explain this. When we talk about cause, we mean explanation before the event. When we talk about cause, the COURSE, we mean explanation during the event. And when we talk about consequence, we mean explanation after the event. So history has to do with explanation before, during, and after. Before, during, and after makes for what we call cause, and consequence. The next slide, please. So in that context, we have change and we have what we call continuity. And the argument, the whole argument is that the historian is at the center of telling this story in the context of a study. That historian is a maker, The historian is a creator. The historian is a producer. And what does he make? He makes history. What does he do? He does history. What does he produce? He produces history. So the historian creator, the historian producer, the historian maker. And in all, my position is that history is what historians do. The next slide, please. And in that context, we understand that we are not made up, societies are not made up of atoms, they are not made up of cells, they are not made up of tissues. Humans and societies are made up of stories, and it is the duty of historians to tell their story. But in the context of a military historian is first of all a historian. And that is why before the sub-specializations of the department into all these, a historian was actually the historian, but with time we had to sub-specialize. So I am first a historian before being a military historian. And first of all, history before military history. My position about history, military history, is that it is the study of war, the political decisions that shape the war, the institutions that wage it, the soldiers and fighters that deploy it, the weapons that permit it, and the societies that suffer it. That is what we call military history in a very short form, and it is an aspect of history. The next one. And in that context, in as much as I have been able to go through this, I have retained the originality of my thought and perception. Here is Mr. Chairman said the Vice Chancellor asked why not courses on that title, which was actually meant to attract rather than distract. And on that basis, my understanding and position in the context of philosophy of history, methodology, and perspective is that there is a cause behind the causes, and there's a cause behind the causes, and a consequence behind the consequences. In the array and the rag bag of causes, there is one cause that every other causes depended on. And that is the position why it is not in the plural, but in the singular. So I'll be looking at the cause behind the causes, the cause behind the causes, and the consequence behind the consequences of change and continuity in the small wars of the Niger Delta of Nigeria. Now, in the context of military history, there are four broad themes, especially it has to do with Nigerian military history, which we've bequeathed from very illustrious military historians. And the first has to do with in the context of military confrontation with European imperial and colonial powers, which we'll look at in the Niger Delta very soon. The Nigerian Civil War is the next one, and then various peace support operations carried out by the Nigerian military, and then insurgency and counterinsurgency, terrorism and counterterrorism in Nigeria in that context, which actually has to do with my sub-specialization. The next slide, please. And I consider myself that I've been fully equipped and trained by very illustrious predecessors and also very sound military officers to stand here and equipped with this training to make this presentation of this title. And here I am on this 9th day to present to you this, and starting with the Niger Delta of Nigeria. The Niger Delta of Nigeria makes well known this symbol in mathematics called delta, which has to do with change. That symbol, which is a part of what we used to do with the Honorable Chairman of Uyo local government, Honorable Dr. Umoh, in mathematics, then mathematics, further mathematics, general mathematics, engineering mathematics, and additional mathematics, even pure mathematics, running on differentiations and other aspects of integration. That delta actually means change. And the first one is a superscript, and the other one is a subscript. The first one talks about perceptive or very significant changes, and the other one are very gradual changes like we do in the first function of the derivative. But the understanding is that how did history that has to do with change and continuity connect me to a place called the Niger Delta, which is the delta of the Niger. And what actually the delta there means, it means change in that Niger Delta. So, change and continuity of the historian met with actually the pure algebraic mathematical expression that has been used in geometry and trigonometry and calculus as what we have here. So I keenly look into this. Next slide. And in the context that the Niger Delta we're looking at would go through three periodizations, which we call era. And the periodization has to do with chronology. That's what we talked about, change. We use chronology to identify, monitor, evaluate, and explain change. And the understanding is that the Niger Delta changed in the context of its appellation from first being a slave coast in the 15th, 16th, and 17th, and 18th and early 19th century to becoming what we call the All Rivers Protectorate, and in the 19th and 20th century, and the Niger Coast Protectorate, and it became a part of the Protectorate of southern Nigeria in that context. But when we look at this, the next slide, when we look at this, we'll see that can be split into three identifiable areas. There's a transatlantic slave trade that was a global trade that connected 4 continents for 4 centuries in an unwholesome tapestry: the continent of Europe, the continent of Africa, the continent of North America, and the continent of South America. And the next one, the palm produce era, the era of the staple trade, and then the petroleum, oil, and gas era. The identification is that as one era changed into the other in the context of change, it brought about several small wars in the Niger Delta. That is how small wars do come in here, because in the change from one era to the other, which we'll observe, the outcome were small wars in the Niger Delta. The next slide, please. And military history makes us to understand that wars could either be conventional or non-conventional. I was able to specialize in the non-conventional aspect of warfare, which one of it is small wars. So there are various appellations for this non-conventional warfare, or what we call small wars, and that is seen in the next slide. And you have various appellations that make for what you call hybrid warfare, 4th generation warfare. You would call low-intensity warfare, and people even call it peacekeeping warfare, war of the fleece, shadow warfare, and various other names that have been used to define what asymmetric warfare, what small wars mean. At the center of it, it points that there are 2 kinds of adversary. One is very powerful and strong, and the other is not as powerful. And as such, since war is not the activity of a life force on a dead mass, as non-resistance would mean no war at all, it is understood that war should be such that both sides are equal in power and tenacity to render the outcome uncertain for a while. So when both sides are not equal in power and tenacity, looking at David and Goliath, or looking at me and Mike Tyson, the outcome becomes very, very obvious. So in the context of small wars, the people you call the people that have been often referred to as the insurgent, the militants, the rebels, are considered to be poorly trained. They don't have the discipline. They might not even have the weapons. They can be easily defeated by the wholesomeness of either the British colonial army or the Nigerian army, as this we changed in the periodization. And the understanding is that these wars, unlike wars between powers that are equal, have actually been one of the longest kind of wars. And we'll see for the Niger Delta, it made that contribution to small wars. The next slide, please. So, for the Niger Delta, the general issue of small wars have been referred to as petroleum wars, oil wars, resource wars, new wars, revolutionary wars, low-intensity wars, and even military operations other than war. Various names given to define this in the Niger Delta. The next slide, please. But our understanding is to look at these usages in the context of the various era. Now, for the slave trade era, it divided the African society, but I'll use the Niger Delta particularly, into three kinds of societies. We had the slave trading societies, we had the slave raiding societies, and we have the slave raided societies. Each of these societies were dialectical to the other. They confronted the other, they challenged the other just to provide slaves for the new world market of the transatlantic economy. And in that context, you had sources of slaves being intercommunal wars, kidnapping, banditry, and every other thing that would make the Niger Delta a very violent environment. The next slide, please. That in the context of the British abolition of the slave trade and the attempt to bring up a new kind of trade using humanitarian grounds, but which Eric Williams has actually defined to be the fact that the Industrial Revolution, which the slave trade brought about, led to the need to stop this slave trade because it challenged the trade in staple produce. The Europeans tried to ensure, especially the British, to ensure that Africa, and indeed the Niger Delta, which supplied a significant number of slaves for the West African region, would change that trade immediately and provide the kind of trade that they needed. But it didn't come that easy because some kings, chiefs, and potentates in the Niger Delta continued the slave trade for countries that were interested in it. And as such, one of the response was that these chiefs would either be deposed, sent on exile, killed, bombarded, kidnapped, and every other kind of things would make for the British naval squadron when the British started having their consular authority in the Niger Delta and later Nigeria, would do this to be able to break the spine of that trade and start up a new trade. So you would understand that there were conflicts in the various houses in Bonny, for instance, where you would have the Bonny civil wars and various kingdoms would lead to the formation of other kingdoms trying to separate from this and make their survival possible still on slave trade. The next slide, please. That I have mentioned with the abolition and the emancipation, which led to the of 1807 and 1833. The next slide. That the British would station naval gunboats and squadron to be able to ensure that the slave trade stopped, a trade encouraged for 400 years, for 4 centuries. And when the Atlantic slave trade treaties that they signed to stop the trade were not honored, they had to bombard the place. We would consider how this continued in the context of continuity and how it changed. The next slide. And these were the various kings of the Niger Delta that challenged the British. That those challenges were carried out using small wars because both sides were not equal in power and tenacity. And in this context, King George of Opobo and the rest of them would be considered in the oil rivers of the of what we call the Niger Delta today. The next slide. That when this company rule, which was the Royal Niger Company, slowly gave way to direct colonial rule, which would enter another stage in that context, that you would have various wars even getting to the environment that we are in such area, Ibibio, Eket area, the Akasa raid, the Aru expedition, and various of raids of this would raise locals to react violently using small wars. Some of those wars would make for the Kumeku Wars and even the Akasa raid that was brilliantly and gallantly carried out in 1895 by the locals of the Niger Delta against the company rule, the authority of Britain. The next slide, please. And in all of these, the Niger Delta would have many small wars because of the various raids and expeditions carried out by the British. And those are the expeditions captured on the screen, not to retain you with that. Next slide. And the features of these wars that took place between the slave trade era and the oil palm era in the Niger Delta would be naval bombardment, the destruction of communities, towns, villages, overwhelming use of force and the use of small arms and light weapons, and even the exile, incarceration, and even amnesty. And we are going to see how these things continued in another era, speaking to change in an era, but continuity as it has to do with the event. The next slide, please. And when we get to the crude oil era, which we divided the distribution of the periodization of the Niger Delta, we would have the small wars carried out by, or to go between, in the range among people would call Isaac Boro, that was first carried out after independence in 1966, would have Tom Polo, and would have John Togo. And we'll see how this would connect with many other responses, because for Isaac Boro, you would have the response of the federal government on the eve of the Civil War. For Tom Polo and his co-travelers, you would have the response of the Joint Task Force Operation Restore Hope, and again the Joint Task Force, Joint Task Force Operation Restore Hope would take care of Tom Polo, and then for John Togo, you would have the Joint Task Force Operation Polo Shield, which will later give way for the Joint Task Force Operation Delta Safe. So the insurgencies of the Polos, Isaac Boro, Tom Polo, and John Togo will make for a swift transition in what we are looking at. The next slide, please. And in this particular kind of era of insurgency or small wars, to speak to it, Mr. Chairman, sir, and the special guest of honor, we have considered that it is either greed or grievance, or either the fact that these people engaged in that are rational or they are deprived. The basic debate has been grievance, bordering over issues of oil exploitation, deprivation, relative deprivation, marginalization, oppression, victimization, and all aspects of underdevelopment, which speaks to what is happening to poverty in the Niger Delta, what is happening to unemployment, and what is happening to inequality. But others have argued that it is not just grievance, it is also greed, because the resource of the Niger Delta, the particular resource of the crude oil era, is one that can be easily accessed by anyone. It is called lootable resources. Unlike that of the slaves, unlike that of the palm oil, this one can be easily looted. And as such, people involved in it are in there for business. It is rebellion as business. It is not rebellion as grievance, but rebellion as business. So that brings about what we call the greed thesis, that those actors, those small wars insurgents are very rational. They are not deprived. They know what they are doing, because engaging in insurgency brings about is more lucrative than having a daily job in the civil service, maybe so to speak. The next slide. And few of them, how terrorizing they look out there for the weapon they're using, which would consider that weapon a GPMG, a general purpose machine gun, and even sometimes they use the Brownian machine gun. These are sector weapons that should be used by a sector in an official setting, using the Nigerian military, but these weapons were used by one person. They turned a sector weapon to a personal arm, like an individual, a private arm, that made it very difficult for the Nigerian army or the Nigerian military to win those small wars. The next slide, please. And in the great grievance, the general appellation in the Niger Delta, when I did my field work in the creeks, was that they don't break, mouth don't open, pipeline must burst, make boys chop. And that just speaks to greed rather than grievance. And so people in the region felt that by just being from the Niger Delta, that you should be automatically wealthy. And so you don't need to do anything, that because oil is flowing, and that is what is the foundation of modern Nigeria, then they should be naturally rich. In short, they don't need any qualification, any certification. They don't need to work in any other place. They should be properly compensated, or what we would call, essentially, in political parlance, landing. The next slide, please. Those are the insurgents in their boats in the attempt to carry out an operation to hit a particular center of gravity somewhere. The next slide. Now, many of these, to show further that greed preceded or overwhelmed grievance, you had as many insurgent groups like a telephone directory. The next slide. Those are the various insurgent groups being displayed there, and even cult groups. Next slide. Like the cult groups identified there, even joined and became small wars and indulging in the entrepreneurial violence. The next slide, please. And their leaders, from I take it Tom the Boylof to Tom Polo and the rest of them, I would not deepen in the mentioning of those names, and all of them were commanders having various titles. They could rise from a private or a corporal to a major general overnight, having various nicknames to portray that. Next slide. And foreigners were also involved in the training, actually not in the execution of the war, in that such combat operations, and those foreigners made for an addition I made to the literature, which I call outsurgents, because they were not part of it. They were not part of the insurgents. The next slide, please. And as such, what was obvious was that you still had intercommunal crises, you had territorial clashes, factions, and also clashes during elections, and also in the context of corruption. Indeed, these insurgents and the likes did not fight daily, but were indulged in many other things daily. Elections was actually one thing that they made very troubling for the Niger Delta, making for what would be called democracy in dangerous places. The next slide, please. And these were the ways they could fund their activities, and this funding kept them going. And most importantly was the issue of oil bunkering in that context of funding. I would not want to call it illegal bunkering. I'll just call it bunkering because of the tapestry of corruption that was associated with that industry. The next slide. So they were involved in criminal activities. They were involved in various aspects of breaking police stations, like involved in kidnapping. And I would get to the slide that speaks to when we got a white person in the kind of kidnapping. That one was a very essential product and called an ATM. But essentially, what is important to note is that the media was an addition, was a change in the small wars of the Niger Delta in the crude oil era that was not there previously. This media made people that were in the intestine of creeks in the Niger Delta, people that had neither popularity nor education, people that wouldn't have been known throughout their lives to become superstars and television screen heroes, and things that their level of education could not provide them, the media provided them. The various media, the CNN, the next slide please, provided them with visibility, and that is why people in distant environments in the context of globalization were able to know what was going on in the Niger Delta. Now, we get to the core of this: change and continuity, continuity and change in the small wars. And these are the changes that have occurred, the continuities that have taken place, the continuities and also the changes in the context of the small wars. First, I point to the fact that the Niger Delta still views, or in the context of the periodization of the work, the company rule as being oppressive, very oppressive and exploitative. That means not just the Royal Niger Company, again, as it happened in the 19th century, but also the oil companies of this period under study. And this trend has not been significantly different. That multinational companies have been seen as agents of European imperialism in that context, and these oil companies have been targets of attack. The next slide. They have been targets of attack over time, and the locals, the potentates in the Niger Delta, have misused, abused the resources of this region. And again, just like the Bonny civil wars, where you had a split, or in the Keno houses, you also had the militants of the Niger Delta in the oil and gas, petroleum oil and gas era, fighting among themselves. What we'll call sheds today, together, skin tomorrow. They split themselves up. And what you would also refer to as rebel against rebels. They fought among themselves, and one would argue, why so, if you don't look at it in the context of greed against grievance. The next slide. And they had factions. The insurgent groups had factions. That's why you had so many of them. When they competed again about territories, they had to move and form their own in that context. And in that context, the salad bowl and not the melting pot will actually describe the cohesion of the insurgents in the era of petroleum gas. The next slide, please. Again, in this era of petroleum gas, you still had bombardment. The Joint Task Force, Operation Restore Hope, Operation Polo Shield, and even Delta Save carried out bombardment of insurgent hideouts. But unfortunately, because of the peculiar nature of small wars, most of their hideouts were among civilian communities, where the military would call it collateral damages in many aspects, given that they had to fight in people's houses, fighting in someone's house, fish, or fighting in built-up areas. Such bombardment, like the one that happened in Odi, even made Timaya to release a song called Them Don't Kill Them Mama. Them Don't Kill Them Mama, Them Papa has been one song that has actually described such continuity. From the killings and the bombardment of the naval squadron in 1810 up till the 21st century, you've had continuity in change. The next one. The rivers were still highways of criminality and highways of imperialism. The next slide, too. And again, most importantly, you had the speedboat, you had the gunboat, and you also had the houseboat, which were likened to the naval squadron and the gunboat that paraded the Niger Delta. But again, the gunboats had some challenges because there were some parts of the creeks they could not have access to in low tide. So most times the militants or the insurgents of the small wars timed their battles in the low tide and attracted the JTA, the Joint Task Force, which was the special force of the Nigerian military, into what they call a kill zone. And most of them lost it in that process. The next slide. That's an example of the gunboat. Next slide. And as a change, and this time not continuity, there was this peculiar feature which was air power. With much due respect to the Chief of Air Staff here present, the understanding is that air power gave a different dimension to the small wars in this century, the 21st century. The Mi-35 helicopter gunship would carry out non-contact warfare in these areas, and this was necessary, important, in dislodging Camp 5, Camp Iroko in Baramatu Kingdom that led to the attraction towards amnesty. The next slide. That was an example of the Mi-35. Next slide. And it was also important to note that just like the forces of the Royal Niger Company were not sufficient to garrison the entire Niger Delta, the Nigerian military has not been sufficient to police as a constabulary force the entirety of the Niger Delta because of the peculiarity of the terrain of the Niger Delta that has made it very difficult. The next slide. So, other aspects in which they exiled, like King of Bavarum, they exiled some kings and some local potentates in the strategy of striking the shepherd that the sheep would scatter. It did not work here in the Niger Delta too, of the oil and gas era, because even with the incarceration of Asari Dokubo in 2004, there about 5, it actually led to this insurgent becoming very strong and even forming what was called the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta called MEND. The next slide. So the tactics that was similar in terms of attacking the company, like was done in Akasa raid in 1895, same was done by the insurgents of the small wars of the oil era, crude oil era, where they attacked houseboats, they attacked oil rigs, oil installation, float stations in the Niger Delta, which we call the center of gravity, and even corporate offices. The next slide. The consequences of these small wars was, number one, you had a proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which you have the various ones there with their local names, the Niger Delta names given to them. And the next one you would have, the next slide, you would have this proliferation, next slide please, the proliferation of arms resulting in militarism and militarization and across the periodization. And the next slide would speak to the consequence which led to the formation of a special kind of force called the Joint Task Force. And like I said, it ran through Restore Hope, Pulo Shield. Pulo is an Ijaw word for oil. So it was the defense of the oil in facilities and installations in the Niger Delta. And then you have the one that subsists till date, Operation Delta Save. The next slide. And most importantly again, another consequence was the development of a counterinsurgency doctrine. In 2009, the counterinsurgency doctrine would have a counterinsurgency doctrine of 2009 being the Nigerian Army doctrine. Please move to the next slide. The next one. Yes, the Nigerian Army doctrine in 2009. You have other ones, especially in 2011, when in 2009, when Lieutenant General Dan Bazao was the Chief of Army Staff. In 2011, when you had Lieutenant General Hejerika, you had the whole of this military, Nigerian Army military operations other than war, various volumes, and the Nigerian Army in counterinsurgency operations to be able to guide, because the whole essence is to learn from the previous war to be able to fight better the next war. So the small wars of the Niger Delta in the crude oil era would bequeath the Nigerian Army with the Nigerian military with this. And most importantly, that is the next slide. The Nigerian military would accelerate into becoming a force fully capable of decisively fulfilling its constitutional mandate within a joint and multi-agency framework. Why is it so? This would provide for the first time an opportunity for the Nigerian Army to interface deeper with other security agencies and paramilitary agencies like the police, the DSAs, the various paramilitary agencies across institutions, the EFCC, the prisons, the correction center, all in a multi-operational environment. The next one. And my contribution to knowledge in the field of military history from my experience in the Niger Delta. First is the unwatched child theory. And that theory speaks to the fact that when a child is not watched, then something goes wrong immediately. And the argument is that the Niger Delta has been left unwatched over the years, from the crying of the Willings Commission to the amnesty deal. We've had the Niger Delta being left unwatched in the context of development, and this has actually affected. I developed this theory in one of those days that I left my children in the office, not watching over them. By the time I returned to my private office called the War Room, I found water filled and my property and gadgets destroyed. And while I was very miffed at them, a theory sank into me that this happened because the children were not watched. So the issue of underdevelopment and non-development in Niger Delta has been a function of a poorly watched in the context of that developed environment called the Niger Delta, because we believe that the best counterinsurgency is development. And like Robert Strange McNamara said something very strange, that security is development, and without development, there can be no security. So the best security in any place is development, and that is what the Niger Delta suffered for years of being unwatched. My second contribution that was kinetic in nature, this first one was non-kinetic, the second one was kinetic, that's the use of force, was the snooker strategy. For those of you that play the snooker, the essence of pulling any ball is not to win that particular, is not for that particular ball. But every ball, every cue ball is positional for the next one. The whole essence is to play in such a way that you can play the other one better. So someone can even make a wrong move, but that wrong move is deliberate to win the other move. And that is what I call the snooker strategy, because in most of the operations carried out in the small waters of the Niger Delta, it has been the strategy of complete annihilation. No, that is not the essence. It will be the issue of maneuver warfare, where every warfare is positional in order to make you better equipped to win the next one. The next slide, please. In conclusion, my argument is that the Niger Delta has availed Nigeria the foundation as a state, first of all, even its constitution, because the birth of modern Nigeria starts in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. And again, even the Nigerian military has its foundation in the Niger Delta, from the Glover houses and running even through the building of that through 1863, and the building of the Nigerian army has a very strong foundation in the Niger Delta. And it is upon this and the arguments suggested here that we argue essentially that, the next slide, that in this context, when we look at the Niger Delta, we will see that history has remained unchallenged and the past has resisted negotiation. And again, the cause and consequence of small wars in the Niger Delta of Nigeria has been depicted more in continuity than in change. Indeed, continuity has preceded change, and change has breathed continuity. Indeed, all small wars of the Niger Delta are cut from the same cloth. That is speaking to continuity, more of continuity than change in that context, looking at it from the various pluralizations that we have looked at. And this leads to the next one, that the special guest of honor, the chairman of the occasion, the chief of the air staff side, the commandant of the Nigerian Defense Academy, I stand here to put that in the course of this, that what we have seen, that this lecture makes the case that the small wars in the Niger Delta constitute a classic example in military history that reechoes the historical conclusion of change and continuity, continuity and change, change in continuity, continuity in change, change with continuity, continuity with change, change for continuity, continuity for change, and change is continuity, and continuity is change. Indeed, the small wars in the Niger Delta indicate that history repeats itself, and that history does not say goodbye, but it says to you, see you later, because the present is a replay of the past. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's celebrate Professor Umoh for this thought-provoking lecture that he has given. I'm not happy with that applause. Please, let's celebrate. Let's celebrate him. Congratulations, sir. It is, please, you may take your seat. It is a tradition of this institution to present a copy of the lecture to the university for institutional memory and academic heritage. So on that note, I respectfully invite Professor Umoh to present the lecture to the university.
The Vice Chancellor, sir, and the chairman of this occasion, it is with profound humility and all gratitude that this university has done for me, raising me as an undergraduate student since 1998 through a graduate assistant in 2008 and a professor of military history in 2023, that I present this 131st inaugural lecture where 13 represents my date of birth and the 1 represents my month of birth. The 131st inaugural lecture, which you have providentially orchestrated and made possible on the topic cause and consequence of change and continuity in the small wars of Nigeria's Niger Delta, to you, the acting Vice Chancellor of the University of Uyo. Thank you very much, sir.
Congratulations.
The Vice Chancellor, on behalf of the university, will present a memorable plaque for this distinguished work.
As historic marker for today, the university is proud to present this to you as a token and a symbol that you have been discharged and acquitted as a professor. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. We'll call on the acting Vice Chancellor to make a closing remarks.
On behalf of the university, the council, the senate, the students, we congratulate our lecturer today. You have been able to, as you are presenting the lecture, a word dropped into my mind, that history is story. So I saw his story and his works in the inaugural. And you were able to tell us why you chose the singular instead of the plural, that to all the courses there is a main course as the beginning, the start off. So that's what you relate with, and we really appreciate the erudition. But because you concluded by saying that the summary, that continuity is change, and change is continuity. And as you are saying that, the word that dropped to my mind is, as it was in the beginning, so it will be, and so it will ever be. But, Mr. Commissioner, sir, you identify some wars, small wars, low-intensity wars, guerrilla war, and all sorts of wars. Mr. Commissioner for Works, there is a low-intensity war from Atai village that is disturbing us. So, the historian and the commissioner, the governor has sent somebody to help us deal with this low-intensity war that is on our campus, preventing us from getting our agreed 1 billion naira project going. So now that we have learned of this low-intensity war and the solution to it, the two of you, I'm handing over our security. And another one about linking the university to the student hostel. So that's another low-intensity guerrilla warfare that UNIO is fighting. And you must deal with them. We will not allow you to rest. The governor has promised to, and he has even sent help to react to it. Now, I'm pleased to announce the next person, Professor Insikak Abbas Udofia. Please stand up. Where is he? That's the Emilokon of the next inaugural. It will be his turn on the 31st of April. Yeah, as the Lord liveth. So he will be with us. And then we want to stand with him, all those who have conquered this feat, who have crossed this river Jordan in their professorial career. Please stand up. Let us clap for you. If you have delivered your inaugural, please clap for them. Thank you. You are +1 today. And finally, I extend our appreciation to the special guest, Commissioner for Works. We are glad to have you because you are a key to some of our challenges that we are dealing with. You are with us. And you have seen us, and you have seen our great UNIO in its apogee, in its zenith. So, on behalf of everybody, I congratulate you. Congratulations, our professor and our brand new inaugural lecturer. Thank you very much.
Let's celebrate our Vice Chancellor once again. Thank you so much. We want to, through the permission of the Acting Vice Chancellor,